My friends, welcome. This is Climate Trace. It is a global emissions surveillance system, which uses AI to fuse data from satellites and other data sources in order to track factories, farms, vehicles, even burn piles, in near real time for every square kilometer on Earth. Co-founded by Al Gore, Climate Trace makes its data available to the public for free. And that data is already being used to reshape agriculture and farming practices and to limit consumer access to product. In other words, what food you can buy. We've long heard the promises about carbon allowances, individual carbon trackers tied to your digital ID or a central bank digital currency. But today, I want to expose the actual mechanism that actually makes those promises enforceable. And what's more, it's already live. Let's talk about it. I'm Christian, and this is Unshadowed.
Sorry, but I'm afraid you've already eaten an ounce of beef this week. Your BRIC card says no. Sorry, sir, but your BRIC card has informed us that you have already flown twice this year. You cannot fly anymore.
I've just logged in with my BRIC card and it's saying I've already had 4 hours of internet today and it's locked me out.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
And working on it they are. And it all begins here with this emissions surveillance system, which collects and publishes the data needed to fuel such downstream applications as the EU's Digital Product Passport, which is already implemented and is of course hailed by the World Economic Forum as the next greatest thing for transparency and accountability for emissions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return first to climatetrace.org, where we can pull up their map and view any one of 660 million different sources of emissions, even here in the middle of central Idaho. If you thought you could just move there and watch the world burn, I'm sorry to say, you, through your emissions, have already been detected there. This person has some cows there that are blamed for emitting methane, and so they're on the map. It's equally easy to find cattle operations just outside Moscow here. So I know Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia, but the agenda seems to be steamrolling forward on both sides of that equation. So take from that what you want. Climate Trace also has an API that lets you query it for any place on Earth and different date ranges. So it's not just on the map, where that's interesting enough, you can click through, but the API means that governments can check in for enforcement purposes, and banks can deny loans if you've applied an extra to farmers that apply too much fertilizer, or markets could, any number of enforcement mechanisms could use this data. And that's actually what's so brilliant and evil about this whole thing, is that because the surveillance and the data are free and open to use for anyone, the enforcement mechanisms can be distributed anywhere. The privacy implications alone of that map are insane, right? Imagine you're feeling a little bit chilly, and so you fire up the wood stove, and then later that day you get a notification that you've been fined $1,000 for burning wood on a day that's not cold enough to do that, according to your government. Or the farmer down the street decides he needs to use more fertilizer, and then later that day he finds out the buyer of his crops is no longer interested because now they're dirty. Now they have too high of a carbon rating and they can't sell them anymore. So that's the kind of enforcement that can be done on producers, or on homeowners or homesteaders, or you, right? If you thought you were just going to go out back and do a quick burn pile with some brush. That is already being seen by the eye in the sky. The system is already picking up that activity. You may not be getting ticketed for it now or cited for it, but it's being logged, and it even could be used for enforcement or denying you a loan or whatever in the future. I want to quickly mention that on Climate Trace, you can see that they also are more than happy to offer free technical support to governments that are interested in using this data to implement emission reduction projects. So just as I was saying about Palantir giving free consulting to defense companies in the UK in order to get more data from them, when the agenda needs to be moved forward, suddenly money ceases to be an issue. Suddenly we can provide free consulting to anyone who's going to pass laws to push this decarbonization agenda forward. And indeed, the emissions data isn't just going to stay there harmlessly on the climate trace map. Because of the Scope 3 emissions regulations that are being increasingly adopted so far in EU and in California, this requires companies to obtain and then pass on to purchasers emissions data about their products. So this is how they're going to force that information to get into the supply chain. And then, as I mentioned, the digital product passports, which is, would be way beyond Orwellian at this point. The DPPs, as they say, are now in the EU already required, let me zoom in here, are already required for nearly all products sold in the EU. The initiative aims to enhance transparency and accountability, etc. When you read from KPMG Consulting, their implementation advice for how to follow the DPP, they straight up make it clear that the digital record is going to provide lifecycle data for material composition, what it's made of, but also the carbon footprint right there. So this is all out in the open, right? The Scope 3 regulations, the digital product passport, talking about accountability and transparency about the carbon footprint of products. And then that's going to flow right. Here's the California legislation, which is also advancing the Scope 3 emissions data requirements on products. All of that's going to flow forward into, finally, until it gets to the shelves, right? Until it gets to retail, where we then encounter our own personal carbon allowances. This has been something they've been talking about for a long time. And of course, that even flows further into the credit score, social credit score, and so forth. So I think we better stop there and just say, this is that mechanism. I think it's pretty clear here. The architecture is in place. And again, it's brilliant because the data is all open and public, and no one can get mad about that. And no one can get mad about the enforcement because it's spread throughout the supply chain and throughout any number of actors. So there's no one evil company that people can go petition in front of or boycott. It's the whole system moving to implement this. There is one more thing I wanted to say, and that is farmers are very poorly positioned right now to be able to offer any sort of resistance to this whole agenda. I showed this article on Telegram recently. Outraged farmers are blaming ag monopolies as catastrophic collapse looms. When you scroll down into it, the catastrophic collapse, you can tell I'm not AI. There's the authenticity for you. The catastrophic collapse looming that they're describing is, quote, this coming disaster, is that banks are forecasting farm bankruptcies at 25 to 40% this year alone. That's almost half, we'll say a quarter to a near half of the farms in the US going bankrupt in 2025. That is a complete collapse of agriculture, right? And that's a unbelievable number of bankruptcies in a single sector. And then I had one commenter say, no, don't be ridiculous. They're just going to get another bailout. Yes, that's true. I don't expect all these farms just to disappear overnight. Quite the opposite. I expect them to be forced into complying with all of these new agendas, because we're already seeing that farming in the traditional sense is not just being labeled bad for the environment, right? You're going to get a bad carbon score, and then you're not going to be allowed to sell it. You're not going to get shelf space because people won't be able to afford your carbon-rich products. But farming at its core has been rendered economically unviable. And so farmers are now they're on life support, depending on subsidies, depending on the bailouts year after year. And of course, with any of those dollars from the governments, there are always strings attached. In this case, it will be taking part in whatever new carbon safe methods there are, like the new microbes from Bayer, which may very well also have embedded in them the surveillance microbes that we talked about in the last report. So this ties into a whole bunch of things, and I think we'll stop there before I get even deeper. I'd like to hear what you think about the eye in the sky that is already watching everything you do. For every square kilometer on Earth, for every building in the cities, they have emissions data coming off of them. That means that if there's a factory somewhere and they want to try an experiment and maybe switch up their process a bit, they can't do it because it'll trigger alarms and they'll have to pay fines, or they'll get docked on their credit score, their carbon credit scores, and they will no longer be able to sell. This is a death knell for innovation and certainly for freedom and privacy. But what do you think? So now we've seen the enforcement mechanism. Climate Trace collects the data. Scope 3 regulations push it onto the supply chain. The digital product passports track it through to the retail shelves where our personal carbon allowances ration our purchases. This is ESG for crops, it's rationing for consumers, and it's already live and broadcasting your data right now. Folks, if this message matters to you, and if you believe independent voices should still be heard, please help me keep this broadcast running. You can subscribe over on Substack via unshadowed.org, or support on Patreon, or just share the word while we still can. Thanks for watching.